Today, we're going to be talking about the ongoing housing crisis in this country and the ways it is exacerbating racist outcomes and systemic inequality. To do that, we're joined by California Congressmember Katie Porter from California's 45th District. We're also joined by Maeve Elise Brown, who is founder and executive director of Housing and Economic Rights Advocates, an Oakland-based nonprofit protecting low-income residents across California from predatory banks and real estate developers. And we have with us sociologist Matthew Desmond, the Pulitzer Prize-winning author of Evicted, a book on poverty and economic exploitation through housing. Before we begin our conversation, a bit of context. Real estate developers, banks, and predatory lenders are taking advantage of housing stock and markets to artificially inflate prices and rents. By doing that, they are forcing people into housing instability and even houselessness, and the outcomes disproportionately impacts Black and Latinx families. White families' average net worth is about $171,000, nearly 10 times Black families' net worth of $17,150. Because Black and Latinx families are disproportionately likely to be renters and extremely low-income renters at that, they make up a majority of the nearly 30 million Americans who could be facing upcoming evictions. 1 out of 3 US households were unable to make July payments. More than 4 in 10 Black and Latinx people cannot pay rent in South Carolina. Systemic racism is already causing health disparities in COVID-19 infection and death rates. The housing crisis is making matters much worse. The systems in place are allowing corporations to make money off poor people by putting their ability to have a home at risk. Inequality in the housing and rental markets is dramatically exacerbating existing wealth, income, and racial inequality, and accelerating the spread of COVID-19. Our guest today will help us think about what can be done to change these systems. Thank you all for joining us. And Katie, welcome back to the briefing. I'd like to start with you. We've talked on this program about federal legislation to delay evictions or suspend and forgive rent payments. You've recently stated that big banks are still getting richer despite the pandemic and economic crisis. Big banks use predatory practices to push bad housing deals on economically vulnerable families. This practice has led to the subprime mortgage crisis and Great Recession in 2008. How have practices changed since 2008, and what needs to happen at the federal level to ensure housing is valued over profits?
So what we saw in 2008 and then that crisis was a crisis driven by the banks. It was a financial crisis. And of course, now we're in a health crisis. But what we're seeing is banks are making record profits. And we saw this in part through the Paycheck Protection Program, which was funneled largely through large banks. And they made billions of dollars in fees, making loans that essentially have no risk at all. One of the concerns is we put in place some things and procedures after some safeguards, after the housing crisis, to help make sure that home loans, that people who took them out were able to repay them. We have created a Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to enforce those rules, a place where consumers could go if they were cheated or ripped off, couldn't get a straight answer from their mortgage company. And we created new rules to help make sure that home loans that people are taking out are going to be affordable for them. We're seeing those agencies like the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and those safeguards under attack in the Trump administration. And this is a time when it's not my opinion that banks are making record profits. It's simply a fact. We saw that with JP Morgan Chase recently. The banks are doing just fine during this pandemic, even as homeowners and renters are hurting. So the question is, are they going to be part of the solution? We call them financial services companies, but they're supposed to be in service of something else. And here, I think they're supposed to be in service of helping to support our economic recovery, which means working to make sure people stay housed during this pandemic.
So how do we make them a part of the solution? What's being done on the federal level to try to do that?
So one of the things we're doing at the federal level is talking about whether or not we need eviction moratoria and how long we ought to, and foreclosure moratoria. But there's also important foreclosure prevention programs. And this is actually how I got to know one of our guests, Maeve Elise Brown, was when I was in California working to help enforce the mortgage settlement when the big banks had misbehaved in '08. The banks were tasked with helping families find solutions. If they could afford to stay in their home, maybe bring down the interest rate, maybe refinance. But one of the problems we have is banks aren't great at delivering those programs. And so one of the concerns I have right now with Ben Carson at the helm in HUD is we have someone who doesn't understand housing. He did not know the term REO, which is a term for a foreclosure. He thought I was talking about Oreos, the cookies. This is not somebody who gives Americans confidence that he's going to be able to hold the bank's feet to the fire to make sure that they're applying what we call loss mitigation programs, which I hate as a misnomer because it focuses on the banks and whether or not they're going to suffer losses in foreclosure. Really what we should be focusing on is the tremendous loss to families if they're forced into foreclosure. So there are rules now about when you make an offer to a family to help them stay in the home, some guardrails to make sure those loans are fair. But we need someone at HUD who's leading, and we have not seen that from Secretary Carson.
So you've said before, you're much more concerned about what the law is doing versus what the law says. How is this issue playing out in California so far?
No, it's a huge gap between I always say our problem is we have consumer protection laws. We just don't have very much enforcement of them, which is, I think, one of the takeaways that I got from reading Professor Desmond's book is that both we have a problem with the laws around protecting renters, and then we have a problem with the enforcement of that. Here in California, one of the things that we're seeing is people assume that if the landlord serves them with an eviction notice, that they have no options. They simply pack up and leave. They don't even have the resources or the belief that they could challenge that in court. And so one of the things I encourage people to do is if you are having trouble paying your rent or mortgage, the earlier that you reach out to your financial institution or to an organization like Housing and Economic Rights Advocates, to legal aid, and our governor, Gavin Newsom, has been producing good solutions on this. There's more to be done, but one of the things he's done is commit some more funding to legal aid lawyers to help people with housing problems. And even locally, we've seen the city of Irvine, where I represent, use some of their money from the CARES Act, from the coronavirus response bipartisan legislation to create a rental assistance program. That program opened up on July 13th. It closes on July 24th. People can apply to get up to $1,000 to help them with their rent. So we are seeing some cities try to step up here and fill the gap where the federal government has abdicated responsibility.
So you mentioned Irvine. So it sounds like there's some bipartisan agreement, at least on the local level, that something needs to be done, right?
There's a lot of concern here, even before the pandemic, about homelessness. And I think one of the things that we just have to connect the dots on is the relationship between homelessness and unaffordable housing. So here in Orange County, you would need to make $39 an hour to be able to afford a typical 2-bedroom apartment. That is a far cry from the federal minimum wage. And so a lot of people here are spending 50, 60, 70, 80% of their income on housing. And that doesn't leave any cushion when your income falls or when you become unemployed or when you face an increase in expenses, say for childcare, because schools aren't open and camps aren't open with this pandemic.
Absolutely. I grew up in Orange County. It's very expensive to live there. Maeve, let's turn to you. You run an organization that goes after predatory lenders and banks on behalf of low-income residents. How have you seen real estate developers, banks, and predatory lenders take advantage of your clients at the market level? And who is at the highest level of legal risk?
Well, over the years of doing this work, we have seen some of the most vulnerable people are seniors, people of color, immigrants, limited English proficiency residents, people with disabilities, single women, all targeted for higher cost credit, higher cost loans than what they qualified for, and also being sometimes victims of reverse redlining, where they're getting forced fed tons of unaffordable credit, which is really something we saw in the run up to the last crash as well. These days, some of the current iterations of unaffordable loans, it does look like a replay of some of what we've seen before. We're seeing property assessed clean energy loans where there's debt that's loaded into the property tax being marketed heavily to people who in life cannot afford to repay the debt, but also we're also seeing some of the same marketing techniques, practices that we saw in the run up to the crash. We're seeing people just blatantly lied to about the total cost of what it is that they're climbing into, about what the monthly payments will be. Um, we're seeing shoddy workmanship. And this is really important. We've got an aging population overall. We're in that cycle, right? And the family home ages along with our bodies, and it needs care. And so ironically, as we age and our income level drops, we are living in this, we need this family home that also needs more care. I also want to note that seniors are carrying more and more mortgage debt nationally later into their golden years, and it's making really difficult for them to survive. We've seen some resurgence in hard money lending in our state as well, so that's very high cost, predatory lending, targeting some of the same groups that I have mentioned. So that's some of what's on the table in front of us right now.
Thanks, Maeve. Can you talk a little bit about housing tenure? So this idea that it describes a person's long-term relationship with a home as opposed to rent or homeowning distinctions, which prioritize property ownership and monetary values. Why is this important, and how would focusing on housing tenure mitigate or prevent the crisis we're seeing today?
I love the housing tenure concept because it requires us to really take more of a systems approach to analyzing housing, types of housing, how we live, and the role of housing in our overall well-being. I really appreciate that the housing tenure analysis studies the interplay between risk and housing, that different types of housing tend to be more risky. And if that's the case, that forces us to ask the question of why. And are different types of housing more risky to the same people, or are different groups of people affected differently by different types of housing? And then, who's getting access to different forms of housing? It's a much more, it's like looking at, it's like an ecosystem. Housing is an ecosystem in and of itself, and how we interact with that ecosystem in a really more holistic fashion.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm looking forward to learning more about that concept. Matt, I'd like to bring you into the conversation now. Before COVID-19 crisis even started, you were a national expert. You've written about these issues and discussing the major inequalities across housing markets. How are our housing markets nationwide particularly unprepared for a moment like this pandemic?
The pandemic hit the United States when we were already in the midst of a really deep housing crisis, one we haven't seen for generations. Incomes for many Americans have been stagnant. Housing costs have soared. Rents have doubled over the last 20 years. And the federal government really hasn't stepped up to fill the gap. So less than 1 in 4 families who qualify for housing assistance, like public housing or a housing choice voucher, for example, less than 1 in 4 of those families receive it. And the waiting list for public housing in our big cities isn't counted in years anymore, it's counted in decades. So if I applied for public housing today in our nation's capital, I have 2 young kids, chances are I'd be a grandpa by the time my application came up for review. So that was the situation when we had 5% unemployment. That's the situation when our economy was supposedly humming. The situation is much worse now, and we're seeing people being threatened with eviction, not at the hundreds of thousands, but at the millions right now.
Thanks, Matt. Can you talk about what lessons we've learned? Like, what needs to change? What are our urgent priorities in this moment?
The good news is when the pandemic started to hit and states rolled out eviction moratoriums, basically stopping the eviction crisis, the early data suggests that those eviction moratoriums really did work. Evictions plummeted all over the United States. They plummeted in places that see the highest evictions. And those actually aren't places that are the most expensive to live in the country. So the highest evicting cities aren't New York City or Boston or San Francisco, however acute the housing crisis really is in those cities. The highest evicting cities are places like Tulsa, Oklahoma, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Richmond, Virginia. And I just think it's important to remember that because this isn't just a city crisis, it's not just a coastal crisis. This is a national crisis. So the moratoriums really did matter. The problem is those moratoriums are expiring or have expired. About 40 million renters now live in states with no protections, no eviction protections during COVID, and the federal moratoriums are set to expire in a matter of days. And so if that happens, it's hard not to expect a wave of eviction and homelessness, which just will cause a wave of disease and more COVID infections.
All right, thanks, Matt. Katie, I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond to Maeve and Matt, and specifically the idea that this is a national crisis, and how our viewers out there need to be activated and moving to protect the most vulnerable.
No, they're absolutely right that this is a national crisis. And one of the things that Matthew hints at is that our eviction laws are extremely local and state driven. And so there's a disparity between what it takes to evict someone, the legal protections that someone has varies a great deal depending on where they live. And yet this pandemic is having a national effect on our economy, and the disease itself is now spread widely across the country. So this is absolutely a problem in places like rural America. It's a problem for people who live in things like mobile or manufactured home parks. This is not just kind of big city urban apartment housing, although it's also that too. And so I think that it's important to recognize that we need a uniform national standard. One of the issues is without that uniform national standard, it's so difficult to communicate with Americans who are so busy trying to stay safe, trying to keep their families safe, trying to get to work, figure out how to make ends meet, to have them have to research down to the local city level what their eviction protection is in this pandemic is a real problem. And the second thing I'd comment on is the idea that Maeve-Elise was talking about with housing tenure really goes to this longstanding debate we've had about, is homeownership really better for people? And it really gets out why that often shows up in studies is that homeowners don't move as often. There's something magical about having a mortgage that, for instance, makes you more healthy or gets you in a better school system. In fact, having a mortgage can give you a stomachache in my experience. It's that having homeowners stay put longer. They have more housing tenure. And what's at risk if we don't enact continued eviction protection is a whole lot of people having to move, be uprooted. Some of them will land in with family and friends. That's often the very first stop. So you can envision an evicted single mom with 3 kids moving in with a grandparent or an elderly relative and increasing the disease risk with overcrowded housing, as well as, of course, the risk of homelessness to making the disease spread worse. So housing is a public health issue, and we need to be talking about it that way. When we talk about what are we doing to respond to COVID, just like we're talking about testing or we're talking about treatment, we need to be talking about housing as one of the strategies. It's core to the whole stay at home order, presumes that you have a home that you can stay in.
Thanks so much, Katie. Maeve, Matt, do you want to respond to that, both the transportation moving issue, but also possibly like the equity issues that come to play? So for example, someone in a home maybe being able to, social distance versus, a crowded apartment building. You want to weigh in on that? Go ahead, Maeve.
I'm okay. I'm always happy to jump in. I was trying to give Matt a chance there. Sorry. Where I was really struck as the Congresswoman is speaking about, well, yeah, moving back in with grandma, if grandma even has a house, though, for you to move back in with, because we're looking at a wave of foreclosures also. So, back to the Congresswoman's great point about the fact that we need national standards to protect people. We also need national vision and solutions that are, because part of the ecosystem, there's an interplay between tenants and property owners. Not all these property owners are capable of withstanding 12 months of not getting rent, and yet the tenants have no jobs. Job losses are likely, the predictions are really dire and really ugly, and so having a sort of an intelligent, layered approach that stops us from going into the next foreclosure crisis as we're moving along. I say this based on the fact that we have so many homeowners who've taken in renters to be able to make their mortgage payments over the years. And there's data about how many millennials, even before the pandemic, had already moved back into the family home, and many had never left because it was so darned expensive out there. So we need a national approach that takes into account all these factors, and doesn't assume that every homeowner is wealthy, and doesn't assume that every tenant losing their apartment has someplace else to go.
No, those are really good points. Matt, do you have anything to add to that?
I've seen a lot of evictions, and one of the worst things I've seen on an eviction is there was a surprise eviction with a mom I met in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Her name was Arlene, and the movers had come and they were packing up all her stuff and throwing it in trash bags, and she was frantically trying to find the medication and her phone and just grabbing whatever she could for the night. And her 7-year-old comes home from school, walked home from school. And he comes into this scene. And, I have a 7-year-old, and I kind of imagine what my 7-year-old would respond. My 7-year-old would freak out. He would cry. He would grab his favorite toy. Arlene's 7-year-old looked around, and he didn't cry. And he didn't ask a question. He just turned around and went outside to play. Because for him, that scene was not something that was new. That scene was part of his life. There's 800,000 people that are threatened with eviction every month in America in normal times. And there's people like that kid in Milwaukee who we are stunting, who we are casting into homelessness and poverty, who are making switch schools all the time. Who we are exposing to real health risks by pushing people into worse neighborhoods that are worse housing, and now exposing them to a potentially deadly disease. Eviction right now doesn't make sense for anyone. It doesn't make sense for families like that, and it doesn't make sense for the landlords. It's not like the landlords automatically get paid when they toss a family out of their home. So this is an utterly preventable problem. We know what the solutions are. The solutions that are operating at the federal government work. When families finally receive a housing voucher after years and years on the waiting list, when they finally receive this ticket, so they don't have to pay 70% of their income, 80% of their income to housing costs, but 30%, they do one consistent thing, like study after study shows they do one clear thing, and that is they buy more food. That's what they do. And their kids become stronger and healthier. And so housing is something that the country needs to invest in deeply, because without stable shelter, everything else falls apart.
Thanks so much, Matt. Katie, I know you're a mother, so this is probably very personal for you. Any kind of final words of advice or calls to action for our viewers?
Yeah, I think for those of you who are watching, the concept we've embraced recently of healthcare is a human right. I think where Professor Desmond's work and the life's work of folks like Maeve-Elise and the research I did and work I did before I came to Congress is housing is also a human right. The ability to have a place that you call home and to have some consistency there, that needs to be a human right too. And we need to be talking about housing as a human right, and therefore our government's duty to help Americans have shelter. And the reality is the last time this country made any meaningful investment in housing was the GI Bill. And those folks are now living in nursing facilities and assisted living facilities. So we are long overdue as we talk about infrastructure bill, something our president likes to talk about a lot. One of the biggest, most obvious areas to invest in infrastructure, and one of the best dollar for dollar investments we can make in federal assistance is to invest in both building housing and making sure people can afford to stay in it.
Thanks so much, Katie. And so many people are talking about how this is the moment. I really appreciated your comments after the passing of Representative John Lewis, and just describing how, this is our fight, all of our fight for civil rights, not just, people working in the civil rights arena or who marched in the past. So I appreciate that. Maeve, do you have any final thoughts? think you're muted.
Thank you. Just briefly, that we need to be able to have big picture thinkers come together and take the kind of approach I think that the Congresswoman was talking about, looking at housing as a right, and then looking at how our lives affect how our lives are interconnected, in order to be able to come up with intelligent solutions so that everybody's getting assisted the way that they need to get assisted so that they can keep a roof over their head, more important than ever. So thanks for the opportunity to be on.
And thanks for joining us. Matt, any final thoughts?
I think that was a great last word. Congress is reconvening now, and there's things that need to happen immediately. We need a national moratorium on evictions. We need to stop this right now because the Congresswoman is right. Housing is healthcare right now. We need rent relief. We need to make sure property owners and tenants are paid and that we can stabilize the housing system. And for those that are going through the eviction crisis, we need a lawyer by people's side so they make sure they have a fair shake. These are things that can get done now, and I hope Congress takes up the mantle.
Thank you all so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time and your calls to action. And I really appreciate all of our viewers for continuing to stick with us at the briefing. We'll be back tomorrow. We have an update on federal law enforcement in Chicago with Senator Robert Peters at 1:30 Eastern time. So take care and we'll see you soon.